Welcome to our exploration of one of the most unsettling cases in Boston's history. Please let me know where you are viewing from and what time you are listening to this narration in the comments section before we start. Which locations and what times of day or night these recorded accounts reach are of interest to us. The basement of St. Catherine's Parish was the site of a discovery that would rock the foundations of the community's faith in the winter of 1897, when Boston's cobblestone streets were covered in snow, and the city's gaslights threw long shadows across church facades. An abnormality in the stone wall behind the furnace was discovered by a maintenance worker who was checking on a recurrent leak. His discovery sparked one of the most unsettling investigations in Massachusetts history, which the government would later attempt to hide. Once inhabited by Boston's elite, Beacon Hill had started to gradually deteriorate as the wealthy relocated to more modern areas. With its tower visible from the water, St. Catherine's Parish was a relic of historic Boston. Although the church was constructed in 1842, the foundations were laid a century earlier. Father Thomas Aldrich, a 47-year-old clergyman with piercing blue eyes and a thin face, was left to care for the needs of just a few dozen regular parishioners by 1897 as the flock had shrunk. Martin Keene, the worker who found the abnormality, would later tell investigators that the unusual colored mortar had confused him. When he pulled out one of the loose stones, he smelled something that at first he thought was a dead rat. It wasn't like the rest of the wall, he wrote in his account. Newer, like it had been sealed recently. He didn't understand something much more unsettling was beyond until he had taken out more stones. Records pertaining to the specific discovery have been significantly censored from public archives. All that's left are jumbled stories assembled from police statements, coroner reports, and the few newspaper stories that dared to publish even the most hazy information. On February 17, 1897, the Boston Globe reported merely that items of significant concern were discovered at St. Catherine's Parish, and that Father Aldrich was assisting authorities with their inquiries. We do know, however, that Father Aldrich had left St. Catherine's by February 20th. Boston police had roped off the basement and temporarily closed the church. After arriving on the scene, a number of cops would ask to be transferred to other precincts. 3 weeks later, one officer, James Sullivan, completely quit the force. Records found in 1964 as the old Boston Police headquarters was being demolished show that the St. Catherine's probe was unusually contained. Only his most trusted officers were assigned to the case by Chief Inspector William Harding, who also directed that all documents be sent to him immediately. Copies were not to be produced. His partially surviving handwritten notes contained the mysterious statement, "What was found beneath St. Catherine's must never become public knowledge." The fabric of our community could not withstand it. The maintenance worker found what historians now consider to be a secret chamber, a room about 10 feet by 10 feet that had been neatly hidden behind the more recent brickwork. The actual chamber, maybe a storage space overlooked during subsequent restorations, would have been a part of the original foundation. For decades, people have been speculating about what it might hold. Father Thomas Aldrich had already served in 3 parishes in Massachusetts before coming to St. Catherine's in 1891. All of his prior jobs had been temporary, lasting 2 to 3 years apiece. According to church documents that researcher Margaret Donovan obtained in 1968, his superiors had requested all of his transfers, though no explanation was ever given. According to Donovan's records, which are kept at Boston University, each transfer occurred at the same time that mysterious disruptions occurred at nearby graves. It's also unclear what Aldrich did before becoming a priest. He was born in rural Connecticut in 1850 and reportedly studied medicine for a while before enrolling in the seminary at the age of 27. He never finished his medical education. According to seminary records, Aldrich was a very serious student who was especially interested in the physical vessel's relationship to the eternal soul. One teacher observed that Aldrich had an unusual preoccupation with death and bodily corruption that, while theologically sound, reveals a temperament better suited to scientific rather than pastoral pursuits. Father Aldrich was described as a lonely man at St. Catherine's. He kept few personal belongings, lived alone in the rectory next to the church, and hardly ever interacted with his parishioners outside of his official responsibilities. In a 1932 oral history, Mrs. Eleanor Winters, one of the few regular visitors to St. Catherine's at the time, called him a shadow of a man, always watching, always listening, but never truly present. The case of St. Catherine's is particularly unsettling because of the meticulousness of whatever actions had occurred there, as well as what might have been found in that secret room. A partial inventory of Inspector Harding's personal belongings after his death in 1912 states that the room held surgical implements of professional quality, multiple journals with detailed observations, and preserved specimens that defy Christian burial. The journals, which are only mentioned in passing in official documents, seem to have been the most illuminating feature of the discovery. During the first investigation, Officer Michael Donnelly later told his son that the writings showed a mind of both scientific precision and unfathomable darkness. According to the son's 1953 account, his father would never discuss the specific contents, saying only that they changed how he viewed his fellow man forever. Boston had experienced an especially hard winter in 1897. From December through February, the cemetery grounds were frozen solid, and heavy snowfall had kept many people indoors. When researchers started looking through the period's death records, a trend became apparent, making this detail important. 7 funerals were held at St. Catherine's between November 1896 and February 1897. According to reports, Father Aldrich himself prepared all 7 remains for burial, telling families that his prior medical knowledge made him particularly suited to this final act of service. There has never been any official confirmation of what happened to those bodies. However, at least 2 of the tombs were discovered to be empty when officials dug up 4 of them in March 1897. No documentation of the results of the other 2 exhumations can be found in public archives because they were promptly sealed. According to reports, the affected families were moved to distant states and given compensation from an unnamed Catholic charity. The letter from Dr. James Harriman, the medical examiner who was called to St. Catherine's on the day of the discovery, provides the most illuminating description. Written to his brother in New York, but never dispatched, the letter was discovered among his belongings following his suicide in April 1897. Dr. Harriman's letter continues to describe items in clinical terms, mentioning preservation techniques of considerable skill and evidence of extended post-mortem examination. He mentions that some specimens seem to have been arranged in poses suggesting a perverse tableau vivant. The letter ends abruptly, with Harriman writing that the implications of the care taken, the evident hours spent in this room, haunt me more than the acts themselves. To think that humans walked above and prayed above, while below, the occurrences at St. Catherine's prompted a prompt and thorough response from the Catholic Church. Before the church was permanently closed, Archbishop William sent a delegation from the diocese to see it for a week within days of the discovery. Although there is no documentation of their operations, locals claimed to have seen smoke coming from the church chimney during that time, even though the structure was declared to be empty. Hours before the maintenance workers' discovery, on the evening of February 16th, Father Aldrich himself appeared to disappear from Boston. According to documents found in the diocese archives in 1959, he was discreetly taken into church custody and moved to a hidden location, despite early claims that he had left. According to documents, he was committed to solitary prayer and contemplation in a secluded monastery in the French Alps in March 1897. What was discovered in Father Aldrich's private apartments above the church might be the most unsettling element of the whole case. Officer Donnelly informed his son that they found hundreds of tiny detailed drawings of human anatomy, with a special emphasis on the face and hands, even though the official inventory is no longer in existence. Every drawing had a date, some dating back several decades. The rectory also contained a number of personal belongings, including finger bones, tiny fabric swatches, and hair strands, all meticulously labeled with dates and initials. None of the faces were identical, yet all shared a certain serenity that Donnelly found more disturbing than any expression of terror could have been. These dates matched exactly with funerals that Aldrich had presided over during his tenure as a clerical worker when compared to parish death records. The geographic dispersion indicated that his operations had taken place over almost 20 years, encompassing at least 4 parishes. When a former gravedigger from Aldrich's former Worcester parish came forward with a disturbing story in 1923, the case took a new turn. He stated that he had been paid by Father Aldrich to exhume recently buried bodies at least 3 times between 1888 and 1890. The gravedigger, Patrick Mulligan, claimed that he had thought nothing of it until learning about the Boston case years later, despite Aldrich's insistence that they be relocated to consecrated ground elsewhere. He always insisted on being alone with the coffins for a time before they were transported, Mulligan recalled, and said he needed to perform special blessings away from prying eyes. It has never been known what exactly happened during those private days. But when investigators surreptitiously searched the cemetery Aldrich had designated, they discovered no evidence that the bodies had ever arrived. The trail was abandoned until 1932, when a shuttered priest's room beneath the sacristy was discovered during Worcester parish renovations. The diocese ordered the chamber to be closed right away, and all employees were pledged to secrecy. There is no formal record of what was discovered. Dr. O. Herbert, west of Massachusetts State Hospital, created a psychological profile of Father Aldrich in 1943 based on the evidence that was available. West hypothesized that Aldrich may have started with theological questions about the separation of body and spirit, but that these intellectual pursuits eventually evolved into something more unsettling. West described Aldrich as having a pathological curiosity about the vessel of the soul after its departure. The progression from intellectual curiosity to physical exploration to intimate contemplation represents a unique pattern of deviance, West said, one that perhaps began with genuine spiritual inquiry but descended into the darkest recesses of human obsession. The systematic nature of Aldrich's actions is what makes this case so disturbing. This was a man who meticulously planned, recorded, and carried on his job over decades rather than being impulsive or unable to control his desires. The methodical character of his collection, the accuracy of his documentation, and the caliber of his preservation methods all suggest a mind that was both deeply troubled and disciplined. Whether anyone suspected Father Aldrich throughout his years of active ministry is the question that has plagued and still baffles investigators. According to a number of reports, the parishioners thought he was odd but not dangerous. Aldrich had cold hands that lingered too long when offering communion, according to one attendee. And Mrs. Winters observed that he had a habit of looking at you during confessions, as if he were cataloging your features for future reference. The story of Sister Mary Augustine, a visiting nun at St. Catherine's on holy days, is arguably the most instructive. I find myself unable to be alone in his presence without a sense of profound unease. She wrote in a private letter to her superior mother in 1896, "There is something in Father Aldrich's demeanor that disturbs my spirit. He speaks of the dead with a familiarity that suggests not the appropriate detachment of a spiritual guide, but the intimacy of a lover." The letter was never followed through on. Soon after, Sister Mary Augustine was transferred to a convent in Rhode Island. She would subsequently report to authorities that she had once seen Father Aldrich come late at night to the rectory, his black clerical attire clearly stained with filth. In response to her question the following day about whether he had been called to a late-night emergency, he said he had been visiting old friends who no longer have voices but still have much to teach. On March 30th, 1897, the Boston police inquiry was legally closed. No charges were brought against anyone, and the public was not given an official explanation. Only the Archbishop and 3 senior priests were present during the deconsecration service of St. Catherine's Parish. The structure was abandoned until 1902, when a private buyer purchased it and turned it into a storehouse. Before the conversion, the basement was filled with concrete, which sealed off any remaining architectural evidence. We may never know the entire scope of Father Aldrich's work. Records indicate that during his tenure as a clerical assistant, he attended about 200 funerals. It is unknown how many became the focus of his private research. It is evident that the state and church leadership deemed the issue to be significant enough to justify drastic repression measures. A brief note in the Alpine Monastery's registry, dated November 1899, states, "Father Thomas Aldrich departed from this world during the night. His final confession has been sealed by order of Rome. May God have mercy on his soul." This is the last confirmed information about Father Aldrich. His burial location is unknown. When the warehouse that had been St. Catherine's was being demolished in 1964, workers found a little lead box sealed inside the basement's concrete. A journal with aged, fragile pages was inside. Several employees read passages from the journal before officials secured the spot. The journal was seized by federal authorities and has never been made public. According to one who spoke to a researcher in 1968 under condition of anonymity, the writings included detailed observations about the changing expressions of the dead and philosophies about capturing the exact moment when the soul departs from the flesh. There are still rumors that it had tiny photographic plates of Aldrich's subjects in addition to essays. If accurate, these would be among the first instances of forensic photography being used for private reflection, rather than identification or record. The behaviors themselves may not be the most horrifying part of the case, but rather the issues they bring up with perception and trust. Despite having obsessions that went against moral and legal norms, Father Thomas Aldrich was a revered spiritual leader who performed funerals, gave communion, heard confessions, and consoled the grieving. How many people were aware of his oddities but disregarded their intuition? How many anomalous situations were excused due to his position? The St. Catherine's case serves as a reminder of the evil that can lurk behind well-respected exteriors and of people's propensity to overlook minor red flags when they contradict long-standing confidence. Father Aldrich's activities went unnoticed, not because he was especially skilled at hiding things, but rather because the nature of his crimes was so far from the norm that, even in the face of proof, few could imagine them. Today, an office building stands where St. Catherine's formerly was in Boston. Few employees are aware of the history of the area beneath their feet, and even fewer are aware of the priest who used to lead services above a secret room where he indulged his fascination with the dead. Official sources have attempted to obliterate the case, but it still exists in locked archives, personal narratives, and fractured records, a troubling chapter in Boston's history. In his final note on the case, Inspector Harding may have had the last say. Some cases test not just our legal frameworks, but our very comprehension of human nature. What we found at St. Catherine's belongs in that category. There are some doors that, once opened, can never be fully closed again. Some knowledge that changes how we see our fellow man forever. And perhaps that is the true horror of the case. Not the specific actions taken in that hidden chamber, but the revelation that someone could move through society, respected and trusted, while harboring such profound deviations from human norms. All that's left is a partial look into a pit of human obsession that very few have thought about, and even fewer have written about. As the sun sets over Boston Harbor, one might ponder how many more mysteries are concealed within the city's lengthy past. How many other well-known people had personal obsessions? How many more secret rooms are still unexplored? And how many otherwise unremarkable structures have hidden histories that would contradict our conception of human nature? On Sunday mornings, Boston's church bells continue to sound. Priests still perform burial rites, hear confessions, and lead services. Life goes on, layered on top of history, some of which is recognized and some of which is purposefully ignored. However, Father Thomas Aldrich's notebooks, which are preserved in locked archives, continue to serve as a reminder of the darkness that can dwell within the human soul, and the fine line that separates devotion from obsession, as well as spiritual reflection from unholy infatuation. You may find yourself reflecting about the people you trust in your own community while you listen to this story. The people who listen to your confessions,
who lead your spiritual life, and who will eventually get your body ready for its last repose. You may find yourself paying closer attention to their facial expressions, seeing the lingering hands, and wondering if they are interested in mortality-related issues. And maybe the real legacy of the unsettling happenings at St. Catherine's Parish in the winter of 1897 is that awareness, that innate caution roused by cases like Father Aldrich's. The significant impact the Aldrich case had on the investigators is something that is frequently forgotten in assessments of the case. According to Massachusetts State Hospital records, 3 officers who participated in the initial search of St. Catherine's were later admitted for what was later identified as nervous exhaustion. Thomas Reynolds, one of the officers, reportedly developed severe panic attacks that prevented him from entering any church. Dr. Haraman's suicide, which occurred just 6 weeks after he examined the hidden chamber, was officially attributed to overwork and melancholia. However, his housekeeper told reporters that in his final days, he had become obsessed with locking his bedroom door and had started sleeping with the lights on. His medical records describe him repeatedly muttering about what waits beneath the pews. He would check the locks 3 or 4 times a night, she said, always mumbling about someone watching him sleep. After March 1897, Martin Keene, the maintenance worker who made the first discovery, vanished completely from Boston records. According to a 1965 discussion with a distant relative, Keene had moved to California and changed his identity. He never spoke about what happened at that church, stated the relative, but he refused to ever enter another house of worship for the rest of his life. The psychological effects were not limited to the individuals directly involved. Attendance at other parishes sharply declined in the months after St. Catherine's closure. Confessions in particular decreased, according to the Archdiocese's archives, as many parishioners expressed hesitation to visit the confessional box. Church and civic authorities had feared this climate of mistrust, and one priest from a local church wrote to the archbishop that the faithful are now questioning what might be happening on the other side of the screen and what secrets might be kept by those who hear their most intimate transgressions. Tensions between Boston's established Protestant population and the expanding Catholic immigrant communities were already present in the late 19th century. At a time when integration was already precarious, the Aldrich case threatened to exacerbate anti-Catholic feeling. The tremendous efforts to keep information about the case under wraps are probably explained by this. In 1968, Harvard University historian Dr. Elizabeth Blackwood made the most thorough attempt to recreate what happened at St. Catherine's. With the help of a private grant, she conducted research that included locating surviving witnesses, comparing police reports and church records, and looking through property records in each of the 4 parishes where Aldrich had served. After 2 years of research, Blackwood was ready to publish her results when she suddenly quit her job at the university and withdrew the manuscript from her publisher. Blackwood never returned to academic work and apparently refused to address the Aldrich case for the rest of her life, saying only in a brief statement that some aspects of history are perhaps better left unexplored. Under the stipulation that they be kept under seal until 2025, her research materials were given to the university archives. The actual nature of Father Aldrich's interactions with the dead is one enduring question that has never received a satisfactory response. According to forensic psychologists who have examined the shaky evidence, his actions point to a very uncommon type of paraphilia. According to Dr. Richard Solomon's 1957 article in the Journal of Abnormal Psychology, Aldrich may have developed an intimate fixation on the corpse as a vessel, seeing himself as a caretaker or companion to the departed. Solomon's analysis implies that Aldrich may have seen his actions as a perverse continuation of care beyond death, rather than as a violation of his priestly duties. The recovered notebook has entries that Aldrich allegedly wrote about maintaining communion with those who have crossed the threshold and preserving the dignity of the vessel even after the spirit has departed, which lend credence to this claim. Given the meticulous selection process that seems to have directed Aldrich's actions, this interpretation becomes even more troubling. According to a review of parish records, he targeted specific people rather than randomly targeting every funeral he performed. The trend implies that he preferred younger persons, especially those who had passed away unexpectedly, as opposed to after a protracted illness, and those who had few or no familial ties and might be aware of major disruptions. It is still unclear how Aldrich moved the bodies from their graves to his secret rooms without anyone noticing. But according to church architectural blueprints found in 1952, there were underground passageways connecting the church to facilities at St. Catherine's and at least one of his former parishes. These passageways, which are typical of ancient religious buildings and are frequently utilized for the discreet transit of clergy or the storage of priceless objects, would have permitted movement away from the general public. In Worcester, where Aldrich served from 1888 to 1890, there are sporadic accounts of nighttime disturbances in the parish cemetery in the local newspaper archives. According to one story, a groundskeeper saw a tall figure in dark clothing moving between the graves after midnight. The figure seemed to proceed toward the church grounds with unnatural quickness when faced. 2 weeks after informing the local authorities of the occurrence, the groundskeeper was fired. The tangible evidence discovered in Aldrich's quarters and secret rooms points to operations that went well beyond simple surveillance. This suggests that Aldrich's interest was not just scientific or theological, but also included aspects of artistic arrangement and personal fulfillment. The combination of surgical instruments, preservation chemicals, and specimen arrangement suggests what Dr. Solomon called an aesthetic dimension to the subject's interactions with the deceased. The evidence that Aldrich might have tried to maintain specific traits or emotions is perhaps the most unsettling. The son of Officer Donnelly recalled that his father had mentioned glass eyes of varying colors among the priest's belongings, as well as materials for restoration of the appearance of lifelike qualities to preserve tissues. These details point to an effort to keep his subjects somewhat alive. Scholars who have examined comparable historical instances observe that people who have such obsessions frequently fabricate complex explanations for their actions. Aldrich's theological education might have offered a foundation for justification in this instance. He was especially interested in debates regarding the nature of the soul's relationship to the body, resurrection, and the Catholic customs around relics, the preserved body parts of saints, according to his seminary classmates. An interview conducted in 1945 with a former seminary instructor recalled that Aldrich had asked whether the divine spark might leave residual traces in the physical form after departure. The instructor had considered this to be philosophical curiosity at the time, but now he wondered if it had been the first sign of a much darker obsession. Additional possible red flags were found throughout the examination of Aldrich's past. He was penalized for spending unapproved time in the anatomy laboratory, according to records from his brief medical training. Aldrich had been found alone with cadavers outside of scheduled class hours, at least 3 times, according to a supervisor. He had left medical training after an inexplicable occurrence involving a corpse improperly preserved outside of official procedures, and when questioned, he had stated that he was studying the transitions of death more closely. Aldrich quit the program abruptly the next week and applied to the seminary shortly after, even though he was never officially linked to this incident. The Aldrich case is especially important to criminologists and psychologists because of the duration of his undetected activities as well as the type of his actions. He reportedly led a double life for almost 20 years, alternating between parishes and pursuing his personal interests. The subject appears to have maintained completely separate psychological frameworks, functioning normally in his public role while systematically pursuing activities that most would find unthinkable.
This suggests not only careful planning, but also a level of compartmentalization that experts find exceptional even among similar cases. According to Dr. Margaret Tilley, a forensic psychiatrist who reviewed the available evidence in 1972, this level of compartmentalization indicated an unusually structured mind capable of maintaining rigid boundaries between different aspects of self. Beyond the immediate horror of his crimes, the Aldrich case has left a lasting effect. In the decades that followed, it radically changed the Boston Archdiocese's approach to managing its priests. According to church records, new procedures were covertly put into place after 1897. These procedures mandated that priests never prepare bodies for burial alone, that diocesan representatives regularly inspect parish buildings, and that any priest displaying undue interest in matters of mortality be reported to superiors. Although these procedures were rigorously followed within the church hierarchy, they were never publicly acknowledged. Decades before such measures were more commonly adopted, they were among the first instances of institutional protections against possible misbehavior by clergy. The eventual fate of Father Thomas Aldrich's remains is the last unsolved mystery surrounding him. Although his death in the Alpine monastery is clearly documented, his final resting place remains unknown. Normally, burial in consecrated ground is required by church protocol, but considering the nature of his offenses, this would have been considered inappropriate. One document, discovered in Archbishop Williams' personal files following his passing in 1907, has a mysterious allusion that might hold the key. Regarding T.A., the vessel that contained such darkness has been returned to the elements. No marker, no memory. May God forgive what we cannot comprehend. That is all that is written in William's hand. According to some scholars, this suggests that Aldrich's body was cremated, which was not common among Catholics at the time, especially clergy. If accurate, this would be a remarkable break from custom, possibly reflecting the extent to which church leaders believed his case to be outside normal parameters of sin and redemption. The Aldrich case progressively disappeared from public consciousness over the ensuing decades, leaving only sporadic documents and anecdotal histories. Michael Collins, a former altar boy, was the last known individual to have had direct contact with Father Aldrich. He passed away in 1982. During an interview in the 1970s, the elderly Collins recalled that Father Aldrich had a stillness about him that wasn't peaceful. It was the stillness of someone listening for something no one else could hear. Collins also recalled that he had been told not to go into the church basement, and that he had once seen the priest come out from below at dawn with hands that appeared to be stained with the chemicals used by photographers. Aldrich had responded to the question of why his hands were discolored by saying that he was preserving memories too precious to lose. When the office structure that had taken its place was razed in 1985 to create a contemporary commercial complex, the architectural traces of St. Catherine's Parish were eventually completely lost. The concrete that had sealed the basement for more than 80 years was broken as the workers excavated deeper than the previous foundation. What was found was promptly removed by officials who arrived within hours of the discovery, according to city records, which state that construction was temporarily stopped when workers discovered anomalies in the substructure. After 3 days, construction resumed, and the incident was never covered by the local media. Non-disclosure agreements had to be signed by the employees, and the issue was formally ascribed to environmental remediation of historical chemical storage. Today, the location is a shining glass tower. Unaware that they are parking in the same spot where Father Thomas Aldrich previously held his private communion with the dead, commuters leave their cars in the garage on the lowest level every morning. Nothing about St. Catherine's Parish or what was found there in the winter of 1897 is mentioned in the building's promotional materials. However, the garage level occasionally has unexplained cold spots, especially in one place where the previous foundation would have been, according to night security personnel. There is an unusual frequency of electrical system failures in that area, and at least 2 guards have asked to be reassigned after feeling as though they are being watched while on duty. These accounts illustrate how historical traumas leave their mark on locations and become ingrained in local culture. What they tell about our shared relationship with troubling history is more significant than whether they are true paranormal events or just the power of suggestion. No matter how much concrete is thrown over them, certain stories will not be buried. We are reminded by the instance of Father Thomas Aldrich that the most horrific tragedies are human, not otherworldly. They come from the innermost recesses of the mind, where obsession has the power to turn even the most noble calling into something unimaginable, rather than from outside influences. His tale serves as a reminder of the evil that may lurk beneath even the most dependable facades and the tendency of people to compartmentalize the unimaginable. The city's secret histories are still preserved in bits and pieces, in oral traditions, saved papers, and community collective memory, even as Boston continues to change and new buildings rise above the foundations of the old. The unnerving incidents at St. Catherine's Parish are only one part of this underground story, serving as a warning that even in the most civilized society, there may be frightening facts hidden beneath the surface. Additionally, as you pass the civic buildings, churches, and schools that make up your neighborhood's everyday landscape, you might stop to think about the histories they hold, the secret rooms that might be hidden behind them, and the personal obsessions that those in positions of authority and trust might harbor. Because the real lesson of the Aldrich case is not about the troubling tendencies of a single guy, but rather about how susceptible we are as a society to those who use authority and respect as a cover for their worst tendencies. It concerns the areas that we declare sacrosanct, and how readily they can be abused. It also has to do with the stories we want to forget and the ones we want to remember. We now tell the story of Father Thomas Aldrich and the secret room beneath St. Catherine's Parish. However, his notebooks, which are preserved in locked archives, continue to bear witness to the depravity of humanity that official history has attempted to eradicate, but which nonetheless reverberates in the communal memory of a city constructed on a foundation of untold tales. The odd timing of his actions in respect to more general cultural changes of the late 19th century is something that is rarely discussed in chronicles of the Aldrich case. American perspectives about death and the body underwent a significant shift in the 1890s. Traditional home preparation of the corpse was rapidly being replaced by the rise of professional morticians. The use of photography to honor the deceased was growing, and medical research was developing quickly, bringing with it new insights into human anatomy that put religious frameworks to the test. Aldrich was situated at the meeting point of these shifting trends. He represented the conflict between spiritual tradition and scientific investigation, having received training in both medicine and theology. His specific deviance could be interpreted as a hideous expression of this cultural period, in which new information and technologies were challenging long-held beliefs about death and the hereafter. In this regard, special attention should be paid to the images that were purportedly discovered among Aldrich's belongings. Those who claimed to have seen them said they were an attempt to depict what Aldrich called the moment of transition, the exact time when life leaves the body, as he wrote about it in his writings. Aldrich is part of a broader tradition of Victorian post-mortem photography because of his fixation with capturing the moment of death, but this inversion of intent is unsettling. Aldrich's photographs seem to have been made exclusively for his personal reflection, in contrast to traditional memorial photography, which aimed to preserve the memory of the departed for the comfort of the living. They stood for ownership rather than remembering, an effort to grasp and hold on to what he was unable to comprehend or accept, the final dissociation of form and consciousness. A progression in his thought process is suggested by a number of entries from his found journal, which was partially transcribed by a clerk prior to the records being sealed. An early entry from 1885 reads, "The body after death remains a sacred vessel, yet emptied of its divine essence." In this emptiness lies a mystery the Church has failed to fully explore. What remains when the soul departs? Is there not some residue of the person, some echo that lingers? I must know. By 1892, his writings had taken a more disturbing turn. Subject F displayed remarkable preservation of facial features 72 hours after departure. The eyes, when replaced with suitable alternatives, convey an alertness that is most compelling. I have positioned the hands as in prayer. The effect is one of peaceful contemplation rather than death's rigid emptiness. I will observe for changes over the coming weeks. A final entry, dated January 1897, just weeks before the discovery at St. Catherine's, reads, "The communion between guardian and vessel grows more profound with each subject. I now understand that my calling has never been to shepherd living souls, but to tend to those in transition, to maintain their dignity in the intermediate state between worldly departure and heavenly reception. The Church would call this blasphemy, but I recognize it as a higher vocation than any bishop could comprehend." This progression from theological questioning to personal ritual, and finally to a completely inverted moral framework, illustrates the way in which isolated obsession can create its own internal logic, entirely divorced from societal norms. The potential ties between Aldrich and some medical researchers of his time are another underappreciated element of the story. He attended multiple lectures by Dr. William Hammond, a controversial neurologist who performed research on electrically stimulating cadaver tissues, according to records from his brief medical training. Even by 19th century standards, Hammond's work, which examined the limits between life and death, was regarded as morally dubious. A letter from 1882 that was discovered in Aldrich's belongings seems to represent Hammond's answer to an earlier question. It begins by saying, "Your questions regarding persistent nervous response in post-mortem subjects are indeed intriguing. While professional constraints prevent me from discussing my more speculative research and correspondence, I would welcome a private consultation should you find yourself in New York. Some investigations are best conducted away from institutional oversight. It is not known whether such a meeting ever took place. Nonetheless, the scientific accuracy that can be seen in Aldrich's subsequent endeavors might be explained by Hammond's influence. The surgical methods detailed in the piecemeal police reports point to knowledge that goes beyond what his scant medical education would have offered, information that may have been obtained through unofficial means inside the scientific fringe of the time. Additionally, the Aldrich case touches on a larger trend of institutional concealment that defined the era's civic and religious institutions. In the 1890s, Boston was run by a complicated web of powerful families, political officials, and religious leaders who were all very interested in upholding the image of moral stability and public order. Given how quickly the St. Catherine's probe was shut down, and how federal officials were involved in the evidence's confiscation decades later, it is possible that the case endangered not only strong secular interests, but also religious sensibilities. The inquiry of who directed the basement's concrete ceiling and who provided funding for the impacted household's transfer suggests resources that are outside the typical purview of parish-level church authorities. In a 1977 reorganization, documents discovered in the municipal archives include a series of telegrams sent by Boston Mayor Josiah Quincy to unnamed federal officials, mentioning only the matter at St. Catherine's and the need for discretion of the highest order. These communications, which date from February 18 to 22, 1897, fall exactly during the time when the investigation was being methodically contained. The borders between church and state in late 19th century America are called into doubt by this government participation, especially when it comes to issues that could be considered disruptive of public order. It seems that the Aldrich case was classified as something that was close to posing a threat to national security, rather than just a criminal or ecclesiastical concern. This categorization allowed for exceptional methods of suppression. Another aspect of the issue that is often forgotten is the relatives of individuals whose graves were disturbed. Parish registrations show that at least 3 of the families whose relatives' remains were exhumed later left Boston completely, despite the paucity of official records. By April 1897, the O'Connor family had moved to Chicago, where their daughter Catherine had been interred in December 1896. In the same period, the Petersons relocated to Philadelphia, where their son James was buried in January 1897. We cannot remain in Boston after what was discovered. The priest's actions were an abomination, but the church's response has been equally unforgivable. They offer money instead of truth and silence instead of justice. James deserved better than this. We all did. This cryptic line appears in a partially preserved letter from Margaret Peterson to her sister, dated March 1897. It implies that the families were not only compensated but were effectively silenced through a combination of financial incentives and implicit threats. It seems that the church was concerned not just with hiding Aldrich's activities, but also with avoiding any public allegations that might be made outside of the nearby neighborhood. When one considers the particular people whose remains Aldrich targeted, another aspect of the case becomes apparent. When his personal notations are compared to parish death data, a clear pattern emerges in his choices. He seemed to prefer people who had passed away unexpectedly and suddenly, especially from severe illnesses or accidents, as opposed to chronic ailments. According to Dr. Solomon's analysis, this preference might have resulted from Aldrich's seeming obsession with capturing the transition between life and death. People who passed away unexpectedly would have been less physically deteriorated prior to burial and would have required less family preparation, which would have made them perfect subjects for his specific interests. The degree of premeditation revealed by this selection procedure disproves the idea that Aldrich was acting purely out of opportunity or whims. Perhaps, even while they were alive, he seems to have deliberately selected possible subjects, watching them during confessions and church services with his future goals predetermined. In this light, Sister Mary Augustine's comment that he appeared to have catalog features takes on a more unsettling meaning. It's possible that her innate unease resulted from an unconscious awareness of his evaluative gaze, which evaluated the living as possible subjects for his personal activities rather than as souls to be led. Another understudied element of the narrative is the Aldrich case's long-term effects on the neighborhood around St. Catherine's. According to census data, the immediate neighborhood's population significantly decreased in the 10 years after the church's closure. A number of buildings were completely abandoned, and property values declined. An atmosphere of pervasive unease that persisted long after the church was deconsecrated was described by previous residents in local oral histories gathered in the 1950s. The neighborhood's decline cannot be entirely attributed to the Aldrich case. The period coincided with broader demographic shifts in Boston as industry relocated and immigration patterns changed. One resident, who had been a child in 1897, recalled that the whole street seemed darker, even in daylight. People spoke in whispers for months. Some homes were never occupied again. The concentration of abandonment in the immediate area of St. Catherine's, however, indicates that even if information about what had happened there was hazy or misrepresented, it had a long-lasting impact on the community's sense of place and security. Another side of the narrative is revealed by St. Catherine's own architectural history. 2 years following Aldrich's arrival, in 1893, the church underwent major renovations, according to building blueprints found during historical study in the 1960s. There was a lot of work done in the basement region during these renovations, which would have given plenty of time to build the secret chamber that was ultimately found. This is especially noteworthy because the improvements were paid for by a private donation from an unidentified patron rather than through the regular diocesan processes. The only information found in church financial records is that the funds came through the good offices of Father Aldrich and were designated specifically for structural improvements of a necessary nature. This implies that Aldrich might have obtained outside funding expressly to establish the architectural conditions required for his operations, a degree of preparation and foresight that further disproves any notion that his actions were rash or self-serving. Additionally, it calls into question potential financial enablers or accomplices who might have shared his interests or been coerced into backing them. One of the most unsettling elements of the case is still the question of whether Aldrich worked alone. The scope and duration of his actions indicate that total seclusion would have been challenging to maintain, even though no concrete proof of accomplices has yet been discovered. It would have been logistically difficult for one person to handle the transportation of bodies, the purchase of specialized chemicals and equipment, and the destruction of evidence. According to a theory put forth by criminologist James Mitchell in a 1983 analysis of the case, Aldrich might have taken advantage of weaker members of his parishes, possibly those with cognitive impairments or intense religious fervor, to help with some of his operations without fully understanding their nature. This would account for the operational needs of his operations and explain why there were no conscious accomplices. Thomas Quinn, a groundskeeper who lived in a modest outbuilding on the church grounds and was described as simple in mind but diligent in labor, is mentioned in parish records from St. Catherine's. Weeks before the underground compartment was found, in January 1897, Quinn vanished from church employment records. No other details regarding his location have ever been discovered. The destiny of his copious works may be the subject of the last chapter of the Aldrich story, although the journal found in 1964 was formally seized. There are whispers in academic circles that copies of at least some of the journal were made prior to the place being secured by authorities. Although these purported copies have never been made public, a number of criminology and abnormal psychology researchers have written analyses indicating knowledge of the original source material that has never been made public. The portions that explain Aldrich's theological arguments in Dr. Eliza Montgomery's 1976 research of religious rationalization in aberrant behavior seem too particular to be based merely on second-hand reports. In a similar vein, information about Aldrich's preservation methods that is not found in any public sources is included in Professor Richard Keller's 1981 criminological analysis. Regarding their sources, both researchers refuse to provide any details, citing only confidential archival materials when asked. This raises the prospect that Aldrich's works might still be read in some academic or professional circles, with just a small number of people aware of their contents being concealed from the general public because of their potentially troubling content or legal issues. Ultimately, the Aldrich case is more than a gruesome chapter in Boston's history or a historical curiosity. It serves as a potent illustration of how governmental, religious, and social organizations react when faced with actions that deviate from accepted standards to the point that they jeopardize fundamental beliefs about social order and human nature. This institutional response raises serious concerns about the limits of public knowledge and the authority of authorities to decide which parts of history should be remembered and which should be buried. The systematic suppression of information, the relocation of witnesses, and the physical sealing of evidence beneath concrete all point to a collective decision that some truths are too disturbing to acknowledge publicly. A new generation of historians and psychologists awaits the chance to study materials that could provide more insight into one of the city's darkest periods, as Boston gets ready for the 2025 opening of the sealed Blackwood Archives, which will fall on the 60th anniversary of her abruptly ended research. What they uncover might just add to the mystery surrounding Father Thomas Aldrich and the secret room beneath St. Catherine's Parish. Or it might finally answer the questions that have lingered for more than a century. What is certain is that there are levels of human complexity that are difficult to define or comprehend beneath the meticulously preserved exterior of civilization, beneath the reassuring frameworks of authority and tradition. The Aldrich case serves as a reminder that the most horrific horrors are wholly human and not supernatural. They originate in the incomprehensible mazes of the mind, where obsession, intelligence, and perverted motivation can come together to produce actions that transcend the bounds of accepted morality. And when you think about this story, passed down through time and space to wherever you might be listening, you might find yourself seeing the institutions you have been taught to revere without question, and the respected people in your own community in a different light. The true legacy of the Aldrich case may be more than just a historical curiosity. It may serve as a reminder to trust your instincts and to realize that, beneath the most respectable facades, behind clerical collars and professional titles, and behind position and authority, there may be realities we would prefer not to acknowledge. Perhaps you will find yourself paying closer attention to that instinctive unease that occasionally arises in the presence of certain people, that subtle warning from the primitive parts of your brain that something is not quite as it should be. It is impossible to completely close certain doors once they have been opened. Certain knowledge permanently alters our perception of other people.